Riven jumped up beside her, resting his head in her lap. She let her fingers drift over his fur, finding the familiar scar just under his right ear, a reminder of the night he'd lunged at the door to protect her when everything had gone wrong. No matter what came next, she knew she owed her voice, her safety, her very future to this dog. And that thought made something new rise in her chest. Not grief, not fear, but a purpose she hadn't yet named. The next morning, she met with Detective Ross again, this time at the station. He greeted her with a small smile and motioned her into a private room. "You've got a choice to make," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Alara opened it slowly. Inside was an official witness statement request form, something she never thought would be addressed to her, not after everything. Ross watched her reaction carefully. "You're not obligated," he said gently, "but if you're willing to testify again, it could help build the full case against Miriam. We've uncovered more, bank records, false reports, files she never meant anyone to see. But your voice could be the difference between her walking free or facing real consequences." Alara didn't answer right away. She looked down at the pen in her hand. For most of her life, people had used paperwork to define her. Foster files, school notes, warning slips, false accusations. But now, the same paper could be the thing that held her truth permanently in the eyes of the law, not just in her own story, but for the others who had lived under Miriam's control and stayed silent. She signed. Outside the station, the city moved on like it always did. Cars passed, people hustled down sidewalks, and windows glowed with lives she'd never know. But this time, Alara didn't feel like she was on the outside of it all. She felt like she had something to offer it. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into helping at the therapy center. The director had offered her a part-time assistant position, and for the first time, Alara earned something of her own. Her days were spent folding towels, setting up rooms, and sitting in on group sessions with Riven. He had become somewhat of a legend there now, the dog who saved his girl in court, who could sense fear before it showed on the face, who leaned against people when they were too broken to speak. But it wasn't just Riven who changed lives. Alara began speaking to younger kids who had grown up in the system, some of them just like she had been, told to be quiet, not trusted when they spoke. She didn't give them rehearsed speeches. She just listened. She told them the truth, that being believed changes everything, that sometimes it only takes one witness to break the silence, and sometimes that witness walks on 4 legs. One afternoon, after a long group session, the director called her into the office. She handed Alara a letter, official, sealed, and government-issued. Alara unfolded it slowly, her heart thudding. It was an offer, a scholarship opportunity tied to trauma outreach and canine therapy training. A small program, just a start, but it was real, and it had her name on it. She stared at it in disbelief. The director smiled. "You already know more than most people your age about what healing looks like, and how hard it is. You earned this, Alara." Back at the group home, Alara sat on the porch steps, letter still in her hands, the evening sun warming her skin. Riven laid his head across her lap, groaning contentedly. "You really never gave up, did you?" she whispered. He blinked up at her, unbothered, as if to say, "I never planned to." She didn't know where the road would take them next. Maybe this program would be the first step towards something she hadn't dared to dream. College, independence, a place of her own. Maybe it wouldn't work out. But for the first time, she didn't feel afraid of trying, because she had already survived something much harder. She had walked into a courtroom filled with people ready to condemn her, and she walked out with the truth. She had been labeled a liar, and she proved them wrong. She had been silenced, and she found her voice, and the world didn't just hear it. The world believed. "Get that filthy mutt out of my store!" barked the old man behind the counter, his voice cracking through the dusty silence like a whip. The door creaked open just a little more, letting in the full shape of the dog, a skinny, soot-gray mongrel with matted fur and cloudy eyes. His growl was low, steady, like a rumble waiting to rise into something dangerous. He didn't bare his teeth, didn't snap, didn't bark. He just stood over a ragged wool blanket in the corner of the shop, his body tight with warning. No one moved, not the shopkeeper, not the young woman who had followed the dog inside. Her name was Mira Holloway, and even though her boots were soaked from the rain and her coat stuck to her skin like second skin, she stared at the dog with more curiosity than fear. "He's not leaving," she said, her voice soft but certain. The shopkeeper snorted. Then neither are you. The place smelled of mothballs and mildew. The kind of store that sold things nobody needed but someone once loved. Forgotten typewriters, scratched records, postcards with no names. But all attention had shifted now to the torn, faded blanket at the dog's paws, and the sound, low and trembling, that seemed to come from beneath it. I think something's under there, Mira whispered. The dog, who had been rigid, relaxed just slightly and looked back at her. It was a glance heavy with meaning, one only a heart desperate to be understood could give. Then he looked back at the blanket and gently nosed it forward. Beneath the threadbare edge, something moved. Mira crouched slowly, ignoring the rainwater dripping from her sleeves. She reached out, cautiously, but the dog's growl returned, this time sharper, desperate. Easy, she murmured. It's okay. I'm here to help. Another movement, then a sound, barely audible but unmistakable. A whimper, fragile, wounded. Mira didn't wait. With one swift but gentle motion, she lifted the blanket, and the breath caught in her throat. There, curled so tightly it barely looked alive, was a child, a little girl, no older than 4. Her skin was pale, her cheeks smudged with dirt, and her fingers clutching the edge of the blanket, as if it were armor. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes never opened. The dog backed away only when Mira reached forward and lifted the child into her arms. He circled once, whining softly, pressing his head into the girl's leg like he was afraid she'd vanish again. She's freezing, Mira whispered, more to herself than anyone. And she's burning up. The shopkeeper took a step forward, dumbstruck. How did that dog? Mira didn't answer. She was already moving, pushing the door open with her shoulder, the storm still howling outside. The dog followed, never leaving the child's side. By the time she got to her car, her fingers were shaking. She turned the heater on full blast and wrapped her coat around the girl. The dog climbed into the back seat uninvited, but Mira didn't stop him. He sat like a sentinel, his eyes locked on the girl. At the hospital, nurses flooded the emergency entrance. Mira didn't bother explaining at first. She just kept repeating, "They need to stay together. Please, don't separate them." And to everyone's surprise, the dog never tried to run. He didn't panic. He didn't bark or resist. He just walked beside the gurney like a bodyguard, every muscle alert, every glance fierce, with silent protection. Later that night, after the child had been stabilized and the medical team tried piecing together who she was, one nurse returned to Mira with a sealed plastic bag. "This was under the blanket," she said gently. "We thought you should see it." Inside the bag was a photo, crumpled, stained, but still visible. It showed the little girl smiling, holding the dog by a leash, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Behind them stood 2 adults, faces blurred by time and shadow, but unmistakably family. The back of the photo had a note, just 4 words, scrawled in shaky ink. "Keep her safe, Rusty." And he had. For the next several hours, the girl remained unconscious, nestled in a hospital bed too large for her small frame. An IV drip ran slowly into her arm, and monitors blinked steadily beside her, tracking every fragile heartbeat. Outside the room, Rusty lay curled in the hallway, refusing to budge even as hospital staff stepped over or around him. Mira had tried several times to coax him into the waiting room, but the dog's body stiffened every time she moved too close. It wasn't fear, it was vigilance. He wasn't going anywhere without the girl. Mira sat nearby with a warm drink in her hands, watching the way his ears twitched at the slightest sound from inside the room. Something about the way he stared through the glass made her stomach twist. This dog had known suffering. He'd seen things no animal should, and yet he remained gentle, loyal, unwavering. It wasn't just instinct, it was devotion. Dr. Bennett arrived near midnight, a quiet man with kind eyes and a folder clutched under his arm. He spoke in hushed tones as he joined Mira outside the child's room. "She's stable. No internal bleeding, just severe dehydration, low blood sugar, and hypothermia. But there's something else," he added, his voice lowering. "We found healing bruises, old ones, around her ribs, her back, and wrists. Some deep, consistent with restraint." Mira's heart sank. "You mean someone tied her?" The doctor nodded grimly, or worse. "But here's the strange part. The child still hasn't spoken, not a single word. And yet when she briefly woke up earlier, she reached out blindly. Not for any of us, but for the dog. Rusty, now, watching intently, stood as if he sensed they were talking about her again. Mira turned to him, her throat tightening. She trusts him, more than anyone else. Maybe he's the only one who ever showed her kindness. Dr. Bennett looked thoughtful. We ran her face through the missing children's database. Got a hit. Her name is Clara Elridge. Reported missing 6 months ago. Parents presumed dead, after a fire destroyed their rural home. The case went cold after investigators found no remains, only ashes and signs of foul play. Mira stared at the doctor in disbelief. You're telling me that little girl survived all that? And this dog, Rusty, he must have been with her the entire time. It appears so, Bennett replied. Which means that dog didn't just protect her, he saved her. He kept her warm, kept her hidden, maybe even brought her food. It's a miracle they both made it. Outside, the storm had faded, leaving behind the silence of wet pavement and distant sirens. But inside the hospital, the tension remained sharp, the unanswered questions piling up like bricks on Mira's chest. She stood, walked toward the room, and gently pushed the door open. Clara's small form stirred at the sound. Rusty padded in after her and climbed onto the edge of the bed, carefully, avoiding the wires and bandages. Mira watched with awe as the dog laid his head near Clara's shoulder and let out a deep, relieved sigh. The girl's fingers twitched. Then slowly, they found Rusty's ear. She didn't open her eyes. She just held on. The next morning brought a commotion no one expected. A man in a long black coat stormed into the hospital lobby with 2 officers at his side. His name was Malcolm Theroux, a legal guardian from the Department of Child Welfare, and he claimed Clara was already assigned to a distant relative in another state. She's a ward of the court, he said, cold and official. And the dog is coming with me too, for evaluation. Mira stepped forward, fury flashing in her eyes. You haven't even let her recover. She doesn't know you. She doesn't want you. And the dog? He's not some object. He's the reason she's alive. I have legal documents, Malcolm said flatly. Whether you like it or not, she's being transferred tonight. When they came to take Clara, the hospital lights seemed to dim. The child didn't scream. She didn't fight. But when one of the nurses tried to carry her from the bed, her eyes flew open, and the sound that came from her throat was not a word, but a raw, terrified cry. She clung to Rusty, burying her face in his fur as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Rusty barked sharply and leapt between her and the approaching men, teeth bared, growling like a soldier on the brink of war. The room froze. Call security, one of the officers said, reaching for his belt. No, Dr. Bennett interrupted. Wait. Clara, through tears, finally spoke her first word since being rescued. It wasn't help, or no. It was stay. Every heart in the room seemed to break in unison. Her voice was barely audible, hoarse from silence, but the meaning was clear. She wasn't asking, she was pleading. The dog had stayed for her. Now it was her turn. Rusty turned to face Mira, then Dr. Bennett. His eyes were no longer defensive. They were full of pain, confusion, and silent prayer. He didn't know who these people were. He didn't trust them. He only knew one thing. He wasn't letting go of Clara, and neither was she. For a moment, no one moved. The tension inside the hospital room hung heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Clara's trembling voice still echoed faintly in the air. Just one word, but it had cracked the armor of every adult in that room. Stay. She had whispered it not to them, not to the doctor or Mira or the social worker, but to Rusty, the battered golden retriever, who had become her whole world, her shield, her family. The officers who had come to escort her away hesitated. Even Malcolm Theroux faltered, his cold composure briefly melting beneath the raw fear in Clara's eyes. But then he straightened and cleared his throat, pretending that what just happened was irrelevant. The law is clear, he said. She is a minor. I have authority. The animal can be evaluated later. But the room had changed. Mira stepped in front of Rusty before anyone else could, her voice sharp. You're not hearing her. She hasn't spoken in 6 months, and when she finally does, it's for him. That dog carried her across who knows how many miles, kept her alive, and now you want to separate them because of a paper? She needs professional care, and that dog is not a therapist, Malcolm snapped. Dr. Bennett stepped forward quietly, but with undeniable weight. No, he's not, but he is the reason she's here alive. And if you separate them, I won't be responsible for what happens next. Trauma doesn't follow rules, it follows instinct. She is clinging to the only anchor she has. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. You're a doctor. You know that emotional attachments can be transferred. There are protocols. Foster care. Therapy. She's not an experiment, Mira interrupted, her tone lower but colder. She's a child. And Clara was still holding Rusty, like the world would end without him. The dog had quieted now, resting his head on her shoulder, his body curled protectively around her like he understood every word spoken. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stayed. Later that evening, the hospital's administrator made a quiet call. Not to Malcolm, not to the state office, but to someone in the local district court. Within hours, an emergency hearing was scheduled. Mira, determined to stand up for Clara, volunteered to testify. She didn't know why this mattered to her so much. Maybe because she'd once been that girl too. Unheard, forgotten, and maybe because for the first time in years, something had reminded her that even silence had a voice. By the next morning, Clara and Rusty were transported carefully to the courthouse. But as they entered the courtroom, the murmur from the crowd was immediate. Whispers, gasps. Some people laughed under their breath, clearly not taking the situation seriously. A girl in oversized hospital clothes, clutching an old dog, didn't exactly scream credibility. Malcolm stood confidently on one side of the room, his briefcase open and filled with documents and orders. On the other side, Mira sat beside Clara, her hand gently resting on the girl's back. Rusty lay at Clara's feet, alert but calm. The judge was an older woman named Rosalind Hale, known for being stern, fair, and deeply intolerant of emotional theatrics. She glanced at the child, then at the dog, then at Mira. "Miss Thorne," she began, "you're not related to the child. Is that correct?" Mira nodded. "That's right, Your Honor. I'm the nurse who was on duty when she was brought in. And you believe this dog, this animal, should have a say in what happens to this child." Rosalind raised an eyebrow. "I believe this dog already made his choice," Mira replied. "He stayed with her when no one else did. He protected her when the system failed. And she," Mira paused, glancing at Clara, "she finally spoke because of him." The judge looked over her glasses. "Is this true, Ms. Elridge?" Clara didn't speak. Her small hand moved slowly to Rusty's fur, and she buried her face in his shoulder. The courtroom held its breath. Then, without warning, Rusty stood up, walked to the center of the room, and did something no one expected. He pawed at the torn hospital blanket Clara had brought with her. Something was inside. Gasps rippled through the room as Rusty tugged the fabric open, revealing what looked like a burned, charred notebook and a chain with a locket half melted from fire. It took the bailiff a moment to retrieve it and hand it over to the judge. When she opened the locket, her eyes changed. Inside were two tiny photos, one of a man, one of a woman, Clara's parents. Behind the photos was a crumpled photo of Clara as a baby, and scribbled in fading pencil on the back were emergency contact details. Not for Malcolm or any agency, but for Clara's aunt, who had been searching for her since the fire. That changed everything. The courtroom erupted. Malcolm scrambled to object, claiming chain of custody, unauthorized evidence, irrelevance. But the judge silenced him with one look. "This dog just did what the system couldn't," she said. "He proved the truth." Tears slipped down Mira's cheeks. Clara clung to Rusty, and for the first time in months, she smiled. A real, tear-soaked, exhausted smile. That day, the court ruled that Clara would be temporarily placed under Mira's care, pending confirmation of the aunt's identity. Rusty would not be separated from her under any circumstances. As they walked out of the courtroom, the same crowd that had chuckled when she first entered now stood in silence. Some even clapped. Others wiped their eyes. A few whispered apologies. Clara didn't notice any of it. She only held Rusty tighter. The world had finally seen her, but more importantly, it had seen him, her guardian, her silent hero, and he had stayed, just like she asked. For the rest of the day, Clara barely let go of Rusty. Even as the courthouse emptied and the last arguments faded into the still air, she clung to him like she was afraid someone would snatch him away. Mira sat beside her in the empty corridor outside the judge's chambers, her back against the wall, legs stretched in front of her, watching people pass with sideways glances and subtle curiosity. For once, Clara didn't care. She was used to stairs. What she wasn't used to was finally being believed. Inside Judge Hale's office, the burnt locket and the notebook were being examined under legal supervision. Clara's aunt, the one no one even knew existed because Malcolm had locked all her parents' paperwork away, was being tracked down based on the half-charred address still visible on the back of the notebook. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara had hope. Distant, fragile, but real. "Do you think she'll come?" Clara asked suddenly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Mira turned to her, startled not by the question, but by the weight behind it. This child had been through hell and was still standing, though barely. "She'll come," Mira said softly. "And if she doesn't, I will." Clara gave a faint nod. "But what about him?" She looked down at Rusty, whose golden head rested calmly across her lap. "What if they say he's just a dog again?" Mira leaned over and whispered. "Then we remind them he's the only reason you're alive, and the only reason we ever found out the truth."